What would you do if the key to your future was locked inside a box that everyone said was worthless? What if you had to spend every last dollar you had in the world to claim it, enduring the laughter and scorn of an entire town? This was the choice that fell to Etta Briggs, a young woman of 20, who, at a rowdy frontier auction, paid $90 for a sealed Outlaws strongbox. The whole town laughed, but what they didn't know, what no one could have possibly guessed, was that the box held a secret, far more valuable than gold, a legacy that would not only change her life, but the future of the entire valley. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Etta Briggs and the Outlaws' last gamble. Etta stood at the back of the crowded auction house in Copper Gulch, a ghost in her own life. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies, a scent she had come to associate with public judgment. Just an hour earlier, the auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a stained waistcoat, had sold off her father's belongings: his worn pickaxe, his dented tin coffee pot, his bedroll, his spare shirt, the collection of a life spent chasing a dream into the hard granite of the earth, all sold for a pittance that barely covered the undertaker's bill. She clutched the meager roll of bills in her pocket, the sum total of her inheritance: $97. Her father, Thomas Briggs, had been a good man, a quiet man whose hands were maps of hard labor. He had come to this rough-edged town with a hope as bright and sharp as a new shovel, and he had left it in a plain pine box, his lungs full of the same dust he'd spent a decade trying to sift gold from. His death had left Etta utterly alone, an island of quiet grief, in a sea of loud, ambitious men. The town looked at her with a mixture of pity and dismissal. She was just another prospector's orphan, another piece of driftwood the frontier tide would soon wash away. She was only here to collect the final coins from her father's scattered life, and then she would have to decide which direction to walk, until her shoes or her spirit gave out. She felt the weight of 100 gazes, none of them truly seeing her. They saw her loss, her vulnerability, and in a town like Copper Gulch, that was the same as seeing a weakness to be exploited or ignored. The auction was nearing its end, the auctioneer's voice growing hoarse. "All right, folks, last item of the day, a real piece of Copper Gulch history." Two burly men grunted as they hauled a heavy, iron-strapped strongbox onto the stage. It was ugly, scarred, and banded with rust that bled like old wounds onto the dark, warped wood. This, gentlemen, was the property of the late, not-so-great One-Eyed Jack Callahan. A ripple of dark amusement went through the crowd. Callahan had been a local terror for a few years, a highwayman known more for his bluster than his success. He'd been caught a month back after a botched stagecoach robbery and hanged from the big cottonwood outside of town. Sealed tighter than a miser's fist, the auctioneer bellowed, rapping his knuckles on the iron. Keys long gone, probably at the bottom of the Black Creek with Jack's other eye. What's inside? Could be gold, could be rocks. Who wants to pay for a mystery? A few miners shouted joke bids. 2 bits! A bottle of whiskey! Silas Croft, a bull of a man who owned the biggest ranch in the county, laughed from the front row. "I'll give you $5 for the firewood," he roared, and his cronies howled with him. Etta watched, her mind numb. She was about to turn and leave, to slip out the back door and into the anonymity of the dusty street, when a memory surfaced, faint as a puff of smoke. It was her father, a few weeks before he died, sitting by the stove. He'd been reading a tattered newspaper article about Callahan's capture. "That man," her father had murmured, more to himself than to her. "They got the story all wrong. He wasn't looking for what they think." The memory was a splinter, sharp and insistent. It made no sense. But her father had been a keen observer of the world, a man who saw the grain in the wood and the truth in a man's eyes. On a sudden, inexplicable impulse, a surge of something that felt like defiance, Etta heard her own voice, quiet but clear in the boisterous room. $10. The crowd went silent, heads turned. Silas Croft squinted, then a slow, mocking grin spread across his face. "Well, well, the little Briggs girl feels lucky." $15, he boomed. 20, Etta said, her heart starting to pound. She didn't look at Croft. She looked at the box. Croft was playing with her now, enjoying the show. 30. The crowd was murmuring, laughing. Etta took a breath. 50. A gasp went through the room. This was no longer a joke. Silas Croft's eyes narrowed. He was a man who hated to be challenged, especially by a woman, and most especially by a girl with nothing to her name. 75, he snapped. The auctioneer's eyes darted between them, sensing real money. Etta felt a cold calm settle over her. She thought of her father's knowing words, of the pitying looks, of the $97 in her pocket. 90, she said, her voice steady. The word hung in the air. $90. An absurd sum for a locked box of unknown contents. Silas Croft stared at her for a long moment, then threw his head back and laughed. A loud, cruel sound that filled the entire building. Let her have it. The girl's bought herself the most expensive box of dirt in the territory. The auctioneer, seeing his chance was gone, banged his gavel. Sold, for $90 to Miss Etta Briggs. The room erupted in laughter as she walked forward, her face a pale mask, and counted out almost every dollar she had in the world. Why would a young woman with nothing spend everything on a locked box? What was the memory that drove her to such a fool's errand? Let us know in the comments what you think she'll find inside, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage on the frontier. Now, as the laughter followed her out of the auction house, Etta had to face the terrifying weight of what she had done. The strongbox was heavier than it looked, a dead, stubborn weight that fought her with every step. Getting it out of the auction house was an ordeal in itself, a slow, scraping journey across the plank floorboards, under the amused gaze of the lingering crowd. No one offered to help. They just watched, some shaking their heads, others smirking, as she half-dragged, half-carried her ridiculous purchase toward the door. Once outside, the afternoon sun was a white glare, making the dust of the main street into a shimmering haze. Men leaning against the posts of the saloon and the general store stopped their conversations to watch her struggle past. They tipped their hats, but their smiles were wide and mocking. "Got yourself a real treasure there, Miss Briggs," one of them called out. "Don't spend it all in one place." Laughter followed, sharp and dismissive. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, on the rickety external staircase that led to her rented room above the mercantile. Her world had shrunk to this single, punishing task, moving this iron-bound burden from a place of public humiliation to one of private reckoning. From the swinging doors of the saloon, Silas Croft's voice carried, loud and self-satisfied, as he recounted the tale for those who had missed it. $90 for a box of rocks. I tell you, that girl's grief has turned her mind. Thomas Briggs spent his life chasing fool's gold, and it seems his daughter has inherited the fever. More laughter. The town had already written its story about her. She was the foolish, grieving girl who threw away her last pennies on a dead outlaw's junk. As she neared the livery stable, a figure straightened up from mending a harness in the shade of the overhang. It was Samuel, the old Ute stable hand. He was a man of few words and deep-set eyes, a fixture in Copper Gulch who seemed to exist outside its noisy social currents. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He looked at her face, then down at the scarred strongbox she was wrestling with. Etta tensed, expecting another jeer, perhaps a quieter, more pitying version. Instead, he simply met her gaze and spoke, his voice low and raspy like stones grinding together. "Some locks," he said, "aren't made for keys." He held her eyes for a moment longer, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in his own, then turned back to his work, leaving Etta standing in the dust, the cryptic words echoing in her mind. Just then, Silas Croft himself, smelling of whiskey and arrogance, stepped out of the saloon, blocking her path. He loomed over her, a mountain of smug satisfaction. "Well, Miss Briggs," he drawled, looking down at the strongbox. "You planning on prying that open right here on the street? Let us all have a look at Jack Callahan's vast treasure. Or are you afraid we'll all die of envy when you show us his collection of rusty nails and dust?" Etta said nothing. There were no words that would make a difference. She clutched the rough handle of the box tighter, her knuckles white, and sidestepped him, her gaze fixed on the stairs just ahead. His contemptuous chuckle followed her as she began the slow, arduous climb. Each step was a fresh wave of humiliation. Each creak of the wooden stairs a new note in the chorus of mockery. The journey up the stairs was the longest of Etta's life. With each step, the iron-strapped box seemed to gain weight, absorbing all the doubt and regret that swirled inside her. When she finally reached the landing and fumbled the key into the lock of her room, her arms were trembling with exhaustion. The room was small and spare, little more than a cell. It held a narrow cot, a washbasin on a rickety stand, a single wooden chair, and a small window that looked out onto the dusty, sun-baked alley below. It was a temporary place, a room that held its breath, waiting for its occupant to move on. She maneuvered the strongbox through the doorway and let it fall to the floor. It landed with a deep, resonant thud that seemed to shake the entire building, a sound of finality. Silence descended, broken only by her own ragged breathing. In the quiet of the room, the box looked even more formidable, more hopeless. The last light of the day slanted through the grimy window pane, a single bar of gold that illuminated the pitted rust and the deep scars in the wood. It was an object of pure, brute utility, built to withstand anything, especially the hopes of a girl with $90 to her name. She circled it like a wary animal. There was no obvious keyhole, only a tight, sealed seam where the lid met the body. The iron straps were thick and bolted down with heavy, rounded rivets. She pushed on the lid. It didn't budge. She tried to find purchase with her fingers along the seam, but it was sealed tight by age and rust. It was, for all intents and purposes, a solid block of wood and iron. The town's laughter echoed in her ears, louder now, in the suffocating silence. Croft's mocking voice, the whispers, the pitying stares. A wave of crushing despair washed over her. What had she done? She had traded the last vestiges of her father's life, the last of her security, for a useless, ugly lump. She sank onto the cot, her face in her hands. The impulse that had seized her in the auction house now felt like a fever dream, a moment of madness. She was a fool. Her father had been a dreamer, and he had died with nothing. She was her father's daughter, chasing a ghost story into ruin. She sat there for a long time, as the light faded from the room, turning the gold bar to a soft gray, then to nothing. The box was just a hulking shadow on the floor. Eventually, hunger gnawed at her. She lit a single kerosene lantern, its flickering light casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. She ate her meager supper of dry bread and a strip of jerky, her eyes never leaving the box. It had a presence now, a silent, stubborn challenge. It was a monument to her folly, sitting in the very center of her tiny, empty world. That night, she couldn't bring herself to sleep on the cot. It felt too far away. She pulled her thin blanket onto the floor and lay down beside the strongbox, her hand resting on its cold, rough surface. She felt the texture of the pitted iron, the grain of the ancient wood. She listened to the silence of the town, settling into sleep, and she listened to the silence of the box, wondering if it held anything at all. The next morning, Etta woke with the first pale light, her back stiff from the hard floorboards. The clarity of dawn brought with it a renewed, if fragile sense of purpose. The despair of the previous night had receded, replaced by a quiet, stubborn resolve. She had made this bed, and now she would lie in it, or, rather, she would find a way to break it open. She made a small, weak coffee on her little stove and knelt beside the strongbox again. This time, she would not just look at it, she would study it. Her father had taught her that. He had been a prospector, but he had the patience of a watchmaker. The secrets are always in the small things, Etta, he used to say, showing her the subtle shift in color in a rock that hinted at a vein of ore. You just have to learn how to see. She ran her calloused fingertips over every inch of its surface, closing her eyes to better feel the landscape of its history. She traced the gouges and dents, the splintered edges, the rough texture of the rusted iron straps. She wasn't just looking for a way in, She was looking for a story. And then, she felt it. Along the bottom edge of one of the horizontal iron straps, near a corner, the texture was different. The rust here was flakier, less deeply pitted, as if it had been protected from the worst of the elements. Her fingers detected a series of tiny, almost imperceptible scratches beneath the corrosion. These were not the random scars of a rough life. They were too regular, too deliberate. Her heart gave a small, hopeful flutter. Using her thumbnail, she carefully scraped away a flake of rust. Underneath, preserved in the dark metal, was a tiny, exquisitely etched symbol. It was a flower, a delicate five-petaled bloom with a gracefully curving stem, no bigger than her nail. It was a thing of impossible artistry and gentleness on this brutal, masculine object. Outlaws and highwaymen dealt in skulls, daggers, and threats. They did not deal in flowers. This single, beautiful detail refused to fit the narrative of one-eyed Jack Callahan. It was a wrong note in a song she thought she knew. It was a whisper that contradicted the town's loud, confident laughter. She remembered Samuel's words from the day before, spoken so quietly in the dust outside the livery. Some locks aren't made for keys. She looked at the box with new eyes. She had been searching for a keyhole, a conventional weakness, a place to insert a tool and force a victory. But the flower suggested a different kind of thinking. It wasn't an invitation to brute force. It was a clue, a piece of a puzzle. Perhaps the lock wasn't a single mechanism, but the entire design. Maybe the way in wasn't through the seam at all. She moved to the other corners, her fingers now searching with specific intent. It took time, but she found them. Beneath the rust on the other three corners, hidden under the iron straps, were more symbols, each one as finely etched as the first. A leaf with delicate veins, a curling tendril, and finally, a swollen seed pod ready to burst. A progression. The life cycle of a plant, rendered in miniature on the cage of a dead man's secrets. The discovery of the symbols changed everything. This was no longer a matter of brute force. It was a puzzle to be solved. Etta retrieved her father's old tool roll from her meager pack. It wasn't much, just a heavy-headed hammer, a cold chisel with a blunted tip, and a long, thin file. Tools for persuading rock, not for delicate work. She hesitated. The thought of scarring the box, of damaging the beautiful, hidden etchings, felt like a sacrilege. But she had no other choice. The town's laughter still rang in her ears, a goad to action. She had to know what was inside. She decided to start near the corner, with the seed pod symbol, the end of the plant's cycle. She positioned the tip of the chisel against the edge of the iron strap, just beside the etching. Her father's old dog, a scruffy gray mutt named Dust, who had been his constant shadow, lifted his head from the cot. He watched her with tired, intelligent eyes, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the thin mattress. Etta took a deep breath and struck the head of the chisel with the hammer. The sound was deafening in the small room, a sharp, metallic ring that vibrated through the floorboards. Dust whined softly, a low note of protest. The blow did little more than chip the rust and leave a small, bright mark on the dark iron. She struck it again, and again, falling into a rhythm. It was grueling, punishing labor. Sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down her temples. Her arm, unused to such repetitive strain, began to ache with a deep, burning fire. The iron was stubborn, unforgiving, yielding only in tiny, grudging flakes. Hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky, turning her little room into an oven. Dust moved from the cot to the sliver of shade under the window, his panting a soft counterpoint to the sharp ring of the hammer. He was her only audience, the silent keeper of her lonely vigil, his steadfast presence, a comforting link to the quiet, determined man who had raised him. Every time her resolve wavered, every time the pain in her arm and back screamed at her to stop, she would look at the dog, and then at the etched flower, and she would pick up the hammer again. She wasn't just fighting with a box. She was fighting against the judgment of an entire town, against the specter of her own failure. As she worked her way around the box, a pattern began to emerge. The straps were not all identical. The rivets near the symbols felt different under the chisel, less solid. She stopped trying to pry the lid and focused her efforts on the straps themselves. They were not just bands to hold the box together. She was now certain they were the mechanism of the lock itself. The symbols were the key, a map to its secrets. She began to tap gently around the rivets, listening to the sound, feeling the vibration. She was no longer just a girl with a hammer. She was becoming a safecracker, learning a language of iron, rust, and hidden pins. Her hands, already calloused from a life of hard work, began to blister, but she barely noticed. She was close. She could feel it. The box was beginning to speak to her. After what felt like an eternity of chipping and tapping, her hands raw and streaked with rust and blood, she found it. Near the seed pod symbol, one of the large, rounded rivets was not a rivet at all. It was a cap, cleverly disguised to look like the others. Her chisel had knocked it just enough to reveal a hairline crack around its circumference. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She set aside the hammer and chisel and picked up the thin, pointed file. With the delicacy of a surgeon, she worked the tip of the file into the tiny crack. She wiggled it, gently at first, then with more pressure. There was a faint click, a sound so small it was almost lost in the silence of the room, and the iron strap beside the seed pod sprang loose with a groan. It wasn't riveted. It had been held by a hidden, spring-loaded pin. A wave of triumphant energy surged through her. She was no longer guessing. She knew the secret now. She moved to the next symbol, the tendril, and found a similar hidden pin. Then the leaf. Then, finally, the flower. Each one released its strap in sequence, following the life cycle of the plant. The box wasn't locked by a key, but by a story. A natural progression that had to be followed in the correct order. With the last strap hanging loose, the heavy lid was finally free. It sat there, unadorned, its purpose served. The box was open. Etta sank back on her heels, her breath catching in her throat. The moment felt sacred. Dust, sensing the shift in the room, got up from his cool spot on the floor and came to her side, nudging her sore hand with his wet nose, as if to say, "We did it." She took a deep, steadying breath, the air thick with the smell of rust and her own exertion. Reaching out with trembling hands, she placed them on the edges of the lid and lifted. It came up with a soft groan of protest from the warped, ancient wood. The air that escaped from within was not the stale, musty smell of neglect she expected. It was the dry, clean scent of old paper, of well-tanned leather, and something else, a faint, herbal fragrance like a meadow after a summer rain. She peered inside. There was no gold, no silver coins, no jewels, no bundled stacks of banknotes from a stagecoach robbery. The sight that met her eyes was far more astonishing. The box was lined with faded, dark blue velvet. It was not a cache, it was a cabinet. On top, resting on a bed of dried herbs, lay a thick, leather-bound journal. Beneath it were dozens of small packets, neatly wrapped in oilskin, tied with twine, and labeled with a delicate, precise script. And nestled in a specially carved compartment in the corner was a set of small, beautiful tools made of brass and glass. A powerful magnifying lens, a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, and a tiny, elegant scale for weighing grams and ounces. This was not the strongbox of a brutish outlaw. This was the portable laboratory of a scholar. With reverent hands, she lifted out the journal. The leather was supple and worn smooth with use. She opened it to the first page. The script was elegant, flowing, the work of a highly educated hand. It read, "The collected notes and field studies of John C. Alleman, botanist." Not One-Eyed Jack Callahan. It was a different name, a different man, a different world. The outlaw persona had been a disguise. Flipping through the pages, Etta saw breathtakingly detailed drawings of plants, flowers, and fungi, each one rendered with artistic and scientific precision. Beside each drawing were pages of dense notes on their properties, their habitats, and maps, crude but accurate, of the high mountain valleys and hidden canyons around Copper Gulch where they had been found. One-Eyed Jack Callahan, the bungling highwayman, was a fiction. John C. Alleman, the brilliant scientist, Was the truth locked inside? Etta spent the rest of the night lost in the pages of the journal, the single lantern casting a pool of warm light on the floor of her small room. John Alleman's story unfolded, not in tales of robbery and violence, but in quiet, passionate observations of the natural world. He was a man obsessed with the hidden life of the mountains, a scientist who had adopted the guise of an outlaw to move through the rough territory without attracting the wrong kind of attention. A botanist, carrying delicate instruments, would be a target. A feared highwayman was left alone. His notes detailed the discovery of dozens of plant species, previously unknown to science, many of them unique to the unique geology of the Copper Gulch region. Some had unusual properties, catalogued with meticulous care, but one plant, in particular, dominated the final section of the journal. He called it Silphium eris, or the copper vein bloom. It was a small, hardy flower, with 5 delicate, copper-colored petals, that grew only in soil, with high concentrations of copper ore. Alleman believed its roots absorbed the metal and transformed it into a compound with profound medicinal potential. His research suggested it could treat chronic lung ailments, the miner's cough that had taken her own father and so many others. The oilskin packets contained his life's work, carefully pressed samples of each plant, and most precious of all, vials filled with their seeds. This wasn't just a collection of a hobbyist. It was a potential cure, a botanical treasure of immeasurable value. As the first hint of dawn began to gray the sky outside her window, a fierce storm broke over the town. The wind rose to a howl, and rain began to lash against the glass in violent sheets. Suddenly, a crash from the mercantile below, followed by panicked shouting. A lantern must have overturned. Smoke, acrid and black, began to seep up through the cracks in her floorboards. Fire. Panic seized the street below. Men were shouting, trying to form a bucket brigade in the torrential rain. Etta's first primal instinct was to save the box. She slammed the journal shut, ready to gather everything and flee. This was her vindication, her inheritance, her future. But then she heard a child's terrified cry from the room across the narrow hall. It was the Millers, the mercantile owner, his wife, and their 2 small children. They were trapped. A terrible choice confronted her, in that smoke-filled moment. Save the discovery that could change her life, or save the lives of the neighbors, who had likely laughed at her, along with everyone else. It was no choice at all. Her father had taught her that you measure a person not by what they find, but by what they refuse to leave behind. She shoved a wet rag from her wash basin under her door to buy a few seconds, then threw it open and plunged into the choking hallway. She found Mrs. Miller and her 2 children huddled together, disoriented and crying. Etta grabbed the woman's arm. "The back stairs!" she yelled over the roar of the fire. She guided the terrified family through the blinding smoke, shielding the smallest child with her own body, until they stumbled out onto the rickety external staircase and down into the muddy, rain-swept alley. The moment they were clear, a section of the roof above the hallway collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a shower of embers and flaming debris down, completely blocking the way back to her room. From the relative safety of the street, Etta turned and looked up in horror. Orange flames were now licking hungrily at the frame of her window. The box, the journal, the seeds, everything she had just discovered, everything she had sacrificed for, was being consumed. Silas Croft and a crowd of townsfolk stood watching, their faces lit by the hellish glow, helpless against the combined fury of the fire and the storm. The storm that fed the fire also, in the end, helped to kill it. By sunrise, the torrential rain had subsided to a miserable drizzle, and the mercantile was a smoldering, blackened skeleton. Etta stood in the muddy street, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, staring at the ruin. The place where her room had been was a gaping, charred hole open to the gray sky. Everything was gone. The box, the journal, the hope. It had all been turned to ash. The town that had mocked her now looked at her with a new, sober expression. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, their children clinging to them, approached her. Their faces were smudged with soot, their eyes wide with shock and gratitude. "You saved us," Mr. Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. Our home, our business, it's all gone. But you saved my family. We owe you everything. He put his arm around Etta, and for the first time since her father's death, she did not feel entirely alone. The whispers that followed her now were different. They were not of ridicule, but of awe. Silas Croft, his usual arrogance washed away by the night's events, walked over to her. He looked from her pale, tired face to the burned-out building. "That was a brave thing you did, miss," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Leaving your property to save them. Foolish, maybe, but brave." He didn't mention the strongbox. He didn't have to. Everyone assumed it had been destroyed, its mysterious contents, whatever they were, lost forever. A crew of volunteers began the grim work of sifting through the wreckage, looking for anything salvageable. Hours later, a man's shout cut through the quiet sounds of their labor. "Over here! Found something!" He was standing in the far corner of what had been Etta's room, a part of the floor that had collapsed but not completely burned through. The men pulled away charred beams and debris, and there, sitting in a crater of its own making, was the strongbox. It was blackened, scorched, the wood deeply charred, but its iron straps had held. The intense heat had warped the lid, sealing it shut again, but the box itself was miraculously intact. The men let out a cheer as they carefully lowered it to the street with ropes and set it at Etta's feet. A few days later, the circuit doctor, a calm, educated man from the East named Adams, rode into town. He heard the story of the fire, of Etta's bravery, and of the mysterious outlaw's box that had survived the blaze. Intrigued, he sought her out. Etta, who was now staying with the grateful Miller family, had managed to pry the box open again. She showed Dr. Adams the journal and the carefully preserved specimens. As he turned the pages of the journal and examined the plant samples with his magnifying lens, his professional calm gave way to visible excitement. "My dear girl," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that silenced the curious onlookers who had gathered. "Do you have any idea what this is? This isn't the work of an outlaw. This is the work of a genius. John Alleman. I've read his monographs. He was a brilliant botanist from the Eastern Academies, presumed lost on an expedition out west years ago. This discovery, this collection, my God, this could change medicine in the territory." The townspeople stared, first at the doctor, then at Etta, then at the open box. The outlaw's $90 box of rocks was a treasure after all, but of a kind none of them could ever have imagined. The news of Alleman's discovery, and of Etta's role in preserving it, spread far faster than the fire had. Dr. Adams sent letters, carried by the next stagecoach, to his colleagues at universities and scientific societies back east. Within weeks, replies began to arrive, filled with excitement and offers of funding for a proper study of the plants. Copper Gulch, the town that had been the site of Etta's humiliation, transformed into the seat of her vindication. The people who had once laughed at her foolishness now looked upon her as a kind of hero, a custodian of a miracle. One afternoon, Silas Croft, the man who had led the chorus of mockery, sought her out. He was humbled, his usual bluster replaced by a grudging respect. He took her to a small, fertile plot of land he owned just outside of town, where a clear creek ran through a meadow. "This is yours now," he said gruffly, not quite meeting her eye, the deeds being filed at the clerk's office. "It needs a garden, so that man's work, so it doesn't die." Etta didn't sell Alleman's collection, despite the generous offers that came in the mail. She understood, with a clarity that felt inherited from her father, that she was not the owner of this legacy, but its steward. It was a trust. With the guidance of Dr. Adams, who extended his stay indefinitely, and using the funds that began to arrive from the East, she started the painstaking work of germination. She built a small cabin on the land Croft had given her, and beside it, a greenhouse with panes of glass, brought in by wagon. The people of Copper Gulch helped. The miners who had once jeered now hauled lumber. The women who had whispered now brought her meals and helped her tend the seedlings. She was no longer the lonely, grieving daughter of a failed prospector. She was Etta Briggs, the botanist. The woman who had seen value where they had only seen rust. Months passed, turning the seasons. The small cabin became a home. The greenhouse became a nursery, filled with rows of thriving green shoots. The final scene of her transformation unfolded one evening at dusk. Etta stood in her new garden, the air cool and fragrant with the smell of damp earth and growing things. Rows of small, healthy plants stretched out before her in the fading light. In one dedicated bed, the copper vein bloom was beginning to show its first buds, the petals tightly furled, promising their unique, metallic sheen. Dust, the old dog, now gray around the muzzle, dozed at her feet, content in this new, peaceful life. Dr. Adams stood beside her, inspecting a leaf through his spectacles. "Your father would be so proud, Etta," he said gently. "He spent his whole life searching the earth for treasure." Etta looked out at the valley, now bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. She reached down and touched one of the unopened buds, a small, perfect promise. "He was just digging in the wrong place," she said quietly. "The real treasure wasn't in the rock. It was growing on top of it all along." Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet discovery. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest value is found not in what the world tells you to seek, but in what it teaches you to overlook. If you were moved by Etta's journey of finding worth in the discarded, please give this video a like and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. We'll be back soon with the story of a lone blacksmith who forged a legend from a single, fallen star. What would you do if the only thing you inherited was a ghost, not a spirit in chains, but a memory so faint it was nearly forgotten, housed in a place everyone else considered worthless? For 19-year-old Cora Whitfield, that inheritance was a small, derelict house deep in the pine forests of Fern Hollow, left to her by a grandmother the family rarely spoke of. The deed was a piece of paper. The house, a pile of rotting logs and lost time, or so they said. But the truth waiting inside that quiet, shadowed place was a legacy far richer than any of them could have ever imagined. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the girl who was left nothing and found everything. Cora stood by the muddy track that served as Fern Hollow's main street. The lawyer's letter, a crumpled ball inside her coat pocket. The funeral had been a sparse, quiet affair, attended by relatives who seemed more burdened by duty than by grief. Her grandmother, Elara, had been a recluse for 30 years, a name spoken in whispers, a woman who had simply walked into the forest one day and decided to stay. Cora's own mother spoke of her with a sigh, a shake of the head, a quiet dismissal. Now, with both her mother and grandmother gone, Cora was an island, adrift in the polite but distant currents of her extended family. Her uncle Silas had clapped her on the shoulder after the will was read, his voice thick with false pity. "Don't you worry, Cora. We'll sell the land for timber. It'll be a small sum, but better than a pile of splinters." But Cora had refused. She didn't know why. It was a pull, a quiet insistence in her bones that felt like the only true thing left in the world. She had claimed the key from the lawyer, a single piece of rusted iron that felt impossibly heavy in her palm. The rest of the family had exchanged glances, a mixture of frustration and condescension. They saw a foolish, grieving girl clinging to a ruin. Cora saw the only thread connecting her to the woman she'd never truly known. An old hound dog, Buster, her grandmother's only other living legacy, sat patiently at her feet, his graying muzzle resting on her worn boot. He too was old and considered a burden. He let out a low sigh, a puff of white in the crisp autumn air, as if he understood the weight of their shared inheritance. Cora looked up from the town and toward the dark line of trees that climbed the mountainside. Somewhere in there was the house. Somewhere in there was the beginning of her story, or the end of it. She wasn't sure which. The journey to the house was a slow, rattling passage up a track that was more suggestion than road. Liam, a quiet young man who ran the town's livery, had offered the use of his wagon without her even having to ask. He didn't speak much, which Cora was grateful for. Words felt hollow and useless these days. He just handled the reins, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, while Buster sat stoically beside Cora, amongst the few crates that held all her worldly possessions. The air grew cooler as they climbed, the scent of damp earth and pine needles replacing the wood smoke of the town. The trees pressed in, their massive trunks blocking out the afternoon sun, casting the path in a perpetual twilight. It felt like they were entering another world, a place where time moved differently. After nearly an hour, Liam pulled the horses to a halt. "This is as far as the wagon goes," he said, his voice low. "Path's too narrow from here." Cora looked ahead and saw it. The house wasn't just in the forest. It was of the forest. It was small, made of dark, weathered logs chinked with moss, and the roof sagged in the middle, like a tired old back. A stone chimney, covered in ivy, stood crookedly at one end. The whole structure seemed to be slowly sinking back into the earth from which it came. It looked forgotten. It looked exactly like the worthless pile of logs her uncle had described. A cold knot of doubt tightened in her stomach. What had she done? Buster hopped down from the wagon, trotted to the sagging porch, and sat, looking back at her, as if to say, "Well, here we are." Liam helped her unload her crates in silence, placing them by the side of the path. "If you need anything," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "you know where to find me." He climbed back onto the wagon, and with a soft click of the reins, was gone, the rattle of the wheels fading, until only the sound of the wind in the pines remained. Cora was alone. She walked to the door, the iron key cold in her hand, and faced the inheritance everyone had warned her against. What was she thinking? Choosing this over a clean sail and a fresh start? What secret could a forgotten old house possibly hold that was worth such a lonely gamble? Let us know what you would have done in her place, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden treasures and quiet courage. Now, with the forest growing dark around her, Cora had to face the whispers of the town and the echoes of her own family's doubt. The memory of the reading of the will was still sharp in her mind, a fresh bruise. It had taken place in the lawyer's stuffy office, the air thick with the smell of old paper, and her relative's impatience. When the lawyer read the clause leaving the forest property to Cora, a collective sigh had filled the room. Her uncle Silas, a man whose face was a permanent ledger of profit and loss, had leaned forward. "A pile of rotting logs and memories, Cora," he'd said, his voice a low rumble of contempt. "That's all she left you. Let me handle the sale. You're too young to be saddled with such a thing." His wife, her Aunt May, had patted her hand with limp, cold fingers. "He's right, dear. What would a girl like you possibly do with that place, all alone in the woods?" They saw her as a child, an obstacle to a quick and tidy profit from the timber rights they'd already been pricing out. Her refusal had been met with stunned silence, then a flurry of dismissive arguments that she'd weathered with a quiet, stubborn shake of her head. Back in Fern Hollow, the town itself seemed to echo her family's judgment. As she bought meager supplies at the general store, flour, salt, kerosene, she could feel the eyes on her back. She heard the whispers, the soft chorus of the townspeople. "Poor thing, Whitfield's granddaughter, got nothing but that shack up on the ridge." They weren't cruel, not exactly. It was a practical, frontier pity for someone they saw as making a terrible, sentimental mistake. They were a people who understood the harsh calculus of survival, and a dilapidated cabin, miles from town, did not factor well in that equation. One afternoon, as she walked past a row of neat, painted houses, an old woman sitting on a porch rocker called out to her. It was Elspeth, a woman so ancient she seemed a feature of the town itself. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but her eyes were startlingly clear. "You're Alara's girl," she stated, not a question. Cora nodded. The old woman rocked slowly, her gaze fixed on the forest that loomed over the town. "That house doesn't keep secrets, child," Elspeth said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "It keeps promises." And then she fell silent, leaving Cora standing on the dusty path with the strange, heavy words settling over her like a shawl. A promise to whom and for what? The cryptic warning, or blessing, did nothing to quiet the unease that had taken root in her heart. She spent her first full day in a state of suspended disbelief, moving through the small cabin as if in a dream. The single room was larger than it had looked from the outside, with a sleeping loft above and a great stone hearth dominating one wall. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of dust, softened by the filtered light slanting through the two grimy windows. A simple plank table and two chairs stood in the center of the room. A narrow bed with a thin, flattened mattress was pushed against the far wall. The air was heavy with the scent of cold ash, dried herbs, and the slow, patient decay of wood. It was the smell of time itself. Buster, her silent companion, seemed untroubled. He explored every corner with his nose, then settled by the cold hearth with a contented sigh, immediately at home in the silence. Cora began the slow work of claiming the space. She found a broom and swept the floor, the dust motes dancing like tiny spirits in the sunbeams. She opened the windows, letting the crisp, pine-scented air chase out the staleness. In a small pantry, she found a few jars of preserves, their contents dark and unidentifiable, and a half-empty sack of beans, hard as pebbles. It was a stark testament to a solitary life. As dusk began to fall, a profound loneliness settled over her. The forest, which had seemed peaceful by day, now felt immense and watchful. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, was amplified in the growing dark. She was miles from another living soul. For a moment, her uncle's words echoed in her ears, and the urge to flee, to run back to the distant lights of town, was almost overwhelming. But then she looked at Buster, dozing peacefully, and at the solid, dark logs of the walls around her. This place had sheltered her grandmother for 30 years. It had character. It had strength. Steeling her resolve, she laid a fire in the hearth. After a few failed attempts, a small flame caught, and as it grew, it pushed back the shadows, filling the room with a warm, flickering light. The warmth was more than physical. It was a small victory against the encroaching darkness and doubt. That night, wrapped in her thin blanket on the narrow bed, she fell asleep, not to the sounds of a town, but to the deep, ancient breathing of the forest and the slow, steady groaning of the house that was now hers. The days fell into a simple, quiet rhythm. Cora would rise with the first gray light, share a small portion of her dwindling supplies with Buster, and then set to work. She was determined to make the cabin not just habitable, but a home. She scrubbed the grime from the window panes until the light poured in, clear and bright. She found her grandmother's old patched quilt in a chest and aired it in the sun. She explored the woods immediately around the cabin, discovering a small, clear spring that provided fresh water and a stand of late-season berry bushes that supplemented her meager diet. The labor was hard, but it was honest. It left her tired but satisfied, her mind too occupied for the grief that had shadowed her for so long. She was slowly, painstakingly, building a life from the foundations of another's. One afternoon, she decided to tackle the floors. They were rough-hewn pine planks, worn smooth in paths her grandmother must have walked 1,000 times. As she swept near the hearth, she noticed Buster's now familiar behavior. The old hound, who usually spent his days dozing in a patch of sun, would repeatedly get up, walk to one specific corner of the room, and lie down. He would press his nose to the floorboards, occasionally letting out a soft, low whine. At first, Cora had dismissed it. An old dog's quirk, perhaps, or the scent of a mouse nesting beneath the floor. But his persistence was strange. It was always the same spot, a corner, partially hidden in the shadow of the great stone fireplace. Today his whining was more insistent. Cora put down her broom and knelt beside him, running her hand down his back. "What is it, boy?" she murmured. He nudged her hand with his nose, then looked pointedly at the floor. She examined the area. The boards looked identical to all the others, dark with age, the gaps filled with the dust of years. But as she leaned closer, she saw it. Along the edge of one plank, almost invisible against the dark wood, were a series of tiny, parallel scratches, as if a tool had been used to pry it up, not once, but many times. She pressed down on the board with the heel of her hand. Unlike the solid thud of its neighbors, this one gave a faint, hollow echo, a subtle vibration that spoke of empty space beneath. A shiver, not of cold, went through her. She did not try to lift it. Not yet. She just stayed there, kneeling on the floor, her hand resting on the anomalous board, the house silent around her, holding its breath. The discovery of the loose floorboard shifted something in the air. It was a question mark embedded in the solid floor of her new life. A secret the house was not yet ready to yield. Cora found she could not bring herself to pry it open immediately. It felt like a violation, a trespass on a privacy that had been carefully guarded for decades. Instead, she threw herself into the work of the house with a renewed vigor, as if by setting the rest of the home in order, she could somehow earn the right to its deepest confidence. She mended the sagging porch step with a length of seasoned pine she found in the small, cluttered woodshed. She patched a small leak in the roof, climbing the crooked ladder with a bucket of pitch and a heart full of nervous resolve. With every task, her hands learned the language of the place. They learned the grain of the wood, the heft of the stones, the particular way the door swelled in the damp and settled at night. As she worked, she uncovered more small, intimate traces of her grandmother. Tucked away on a high shelf in the pantry, she found a small collection of birds' nests, each one perfect and intricate, labeled with a tiny, faded tag bearing the name of its creator: sparrow, finch, wren. Behind a loose stone in the hearth, she discovered a small, carved wooden bird, its painted feathers worn away by the touch of a thumb. These were not the possessions of a lonely, bitter recluse, but of a woman who was a keen and patient observer of the world. A woman who found companionship in the small, wild things of the forest. The discoveries made Ilara feel less like a ghost and more like a quiet, steady presence. A silent partner in Cora's labor. Buster was her shadow, following her from room to woodshed to spring, his quiet presence a constant comfort. He seemed to be waiting with her, a fellow guardian of the house's secrets. Finally, after a week of tireless work, the cabin felt clean and whole. The windows shone, the fire burned brightly, and the scent of pine and wood smoke was a clean, welcoming perfume. That evening, as the sun set and painted the forest in hues of orange and purple, Cora knew it was time. She lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the deep shadows in the corners, and knelt once more before the marked floorboard. She took a deep breath, the clean air filling her lungs, and reached for the small pry bar she had found in the shed. The house was ready. She was ready. With the gentle, steady pressure of a hand that now knew the house's tolerances, Cora worked the tip of the pry bar into the seam. The board resisted for a moment, then lifted with a soft, groaning sigh, the sound of a long-held breath being released. She set the plank aside and peered into the darkness below. It was not the raw earth she had expected, but a shallow cavity, carefully lined with thick, black oilcloth to protect its contents from the damp. And nestled in the center was a single, heavy tin box, the kind used for biscuits or tea, its painted flowers faded, and its edges traced with rust. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the reason for the scratches, for Buster's strange insistence. With trembling fingers, she reached into the space and lifted the box out. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the table and set it down in the warm circle of lantern light. There was no lock, only a simple clasp. She lifted it. The contents were not what any treasure seeker would hope for. There was no gold, no silver, no string of pearls. But to Cora, it was more precious than any fortune. The box was filled to the brim with small, leather-bound journals, their covers softened with age. Tucked carefully between the pages of each one were dozens of pressed plants and flowers, their forms perfectly preserved, their colors muted, but still recognizable. A faint, dry, sweet smell rose from the box, the scent of 1,000 preserved summers. She picked up the topmost journal and opened it. On the first page, in elegant, looping script, was a name, Ilara Whitfield. Below it, a date from 30 years prior. This was not a diary of feelings or daily events. It was a work of meticulous, passionate science. Each page was dedicated to a single plant, On the left was a stunningly detailed, hand-drawn illustration of the plant. Its leaves, its flower, its roots. On the right were pages of dense, careful notes. Its Latin name, where it grew on the mountain, the best time of year to harvest it, and, most importantly, its properties. Yarrow, she read, stops bleeding, reduces fever. Mullein tea of the leaves soothes the lungs. Willow bark, for aches and pains. Page after page, a complete encyclopedia of the forest's pharmacy. Cora sank onto the chair, a wave of understanding washing over her. Her grandmother had not been hiding from the world. She had been studying it. The worthless property was a living library, a rich and varied apothecary. And this box, hidden beneath the floor, was its index, its key. She had inherited not a pile of logs, but a lifetime of hidden wisdom. The seasons turned. Cora spent the autumn days learning the forest, using the journals as her guide. She followed her grandmother's hand-drawn maps to stands of elderberry, to patches of burdock root, to the shady spots where golden seal grew. She learned the feel of the plants, their scents, the way they changed with the light. She practiced drying them in bundles from the rafters, just as the journals described, until the cabin was filled with their earthy fragrance. As the first snows began to dust the high peaks, a sickness arrived in Fern Hollow. It came on the back of a cold, wet wind, starting as a simple cough, before settling deep in the lungs, bringing a dangerous, rattling fever. The timing was cruel. Dr. Albright, the town's only physician, had traveled to a neighboring county to assist with a difficult birth, and was now trapped there by a sudden, heavy snowfall that had closed the mountain pass. Panic, cold and quiet, began to thread its way through the small community. The Miller family, who ran the grist mill at the edge of town, was hit first and hardest. Their youngest daughter, Sarah, a small, bright girl of 6, fell gravely ill. Word of her decline reached Cora through a traveling trapper who stopped at her spring for water. The news landed like a stone in her heart. She was afraid. The knowledge in the journals was one thing. Using it on a sick child was another. The weight of responsibility felt immense, terrifying. She spent a long, dark night by her fire. The journals spread open on the table, Buster's head resting on her lap. She read and reread her grandmother's entries on lung fever, her detailed instructions for preparing a mullein leaf poultice and brewing a tea from pine needles and honey. She could stay here, safe in her solitude. No one would blame her. But then she pictured little Sarah, her small chest struggling for every breath, and she saw the faces of the desperate parents. Her grandmother hadn't gathered this knowledge to hide it. Elspeth's words came back to her. It keeps promises. Making a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary, Cora packed a bag with dried herbs, jars, and clean cloths. As the sun rose, casting a pale, wintry light over the snow-dusted forest, she pulled on her coat, told Buster to guard the house, and began the long walk down to town. She found the Miller's home in a state of hushed despair. Mrs. Miller, her face pale and etched with sleeplessness, opened the door. When she saw Cora, a flicker of hope warred with her fear. They say you know things. About herbs," she whispered. Cora could only nod, her throat tight. "Please," the woman begged. "The doctor is gone. We have no one else." She stepped aside, and Cora entered the small, shadowed house, the scent of sickness heavy in the air. For 3 days and 3 nights, Cora did not leave the Miller house. She became a quiet, steady presence in the midst of their fear. She moved with a purpose that surprised even herself, her actions guided by the steady hand of her grandmother's knowledge. She kept a constant fire going, simmering pots of water on the stove to keep the air moist. She brewed the sharp, fragrant tea of pine needles, sweetening it with the last of the Miller's honey, and coaxed little Sarah to drink it, spoonful by spoonful. She ground the dried mullein leaves and mixed them with hot water to create a warm, soft poultice, which she carefully spread on a clean cloth and laid on the child's congested chest. She sat by the bedside, changing the cool compresses on Sarah's forehead, murmuring soft words of comfort she didn't know she possessed. Mr. and Mrs. Miller watched her, their initial desperation slowly giving way to a fragile trust. They saw not a strange girl from the woods, but a competent and compassionate healer. On the fourth morning, the crisis broke. Sarah's fever receded. Her breathing eased from a ragged rattle to a soft, even rhythm. She woke and asked for a drink of water in a weak but clear voice. The relief in the room was a palpable thing, a wave of silent, tearful gratitude. By the time Dr. Albright, weary from his journey, finally made it back to Fern Hollow a day later, the worst of the sickness had passed. Not just for Sarah Miller, but for two other families Cora had gone on to help. The doctor, hearing the stories, went first to the Millers, and then made the walk up the path to Cora's cabin. He was a kind man, with a practical, no-nonsense air. He expected to find folk remedies and good luck. Cora invited him in, and, at his request, showed him the herbs she had used and the journals she had used as her guide. He sat at her small table for over an hour, turning the pages of her grandmother's books, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to astonishment, and then to a profound and quiet respect. "This is remarkable work," he said, looking up at her, his eyes full of a new understanding. "This isn't folklore. Your grandmother was a scientist, a botanist of incredible skill." He closed the journal gently. "Fern Hollow is in her debt, and in yours." The doctor's validation was the final turning of the key. The whispers in town changed their tune. The story of the reclusive Whitfield woman was rewritten. She was no longer the strange woman who ran from the world, but the wise woman who had understood it. Her granddaughter was no longer the foolish girl in the woods, but the inheritor of that wisdom. One evening, there was a knock on her door. It was her Uncle Silas, his usual bluster gone, his hat clutched in his hands. He wouldn't meet her eye. "My May," he mumbled, his voice rough. "She has the cough. It's getting worse." Cora looked at him for a long moment, then simply nodded, and turned to her shelves of drying herbs. The debt was not hers to call in. The promise was for everyone. The snows melted, and the forest floor awoke with the green shoots of a new spring. The sickness was a memory, a harsh story, that now ended with Cora's name. The path to her cabin was no longer overgrown. It was a well-trodden trail. Townspeople came not with suspicion but with questions, with small gifts of flour or cloth, and with a quiet reverence that still felt strange to her. She never took payment, but her pantry was never empty. Behind the cabin, she had cleared a large patch of ground, tilling the rich, dark earth with her own hands. It was the garden her grandmother had sketched on the final pages of the last journal, a plan never realized. Cora was bringing it to life, transplanting seedlings from the wild, and carefully sowing seeds for herbs that needed more sun. The space buzzed with bees and smelled of mint and chamomile, a testament to a legacy made real. One late afternoon, as the golden hour spilled through the pines and set the new leaves alight, Liam made his way up the path, leading a mule packed with supplies. He no longer stopped where the wagon road ended, but came all the way to her door. He stood for a moment, taking in the sight of the thriving garden, the neat stacks of firewood, the tendrils of smoke rising from the chimney. He looked at Cora, her hands covered in soil, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a quiet confidence in her eyes that had not been there when he first brought her up the mountain. "I remember what your family said," he remarked, his voice gentle. "They said you inherited a pile of wood and a worthless deed." Cora looked up from the bed of lavender she was tending. She gazed past him, at the dark, knowing expanse of the forest, then back to the small, sturdy house that stood behind her, its windows glowing warmly in the setting sun. Buster thumped his tail against the porch boards. She smiled, a real, deep smile that reached her eyes. "They thought she left me a piece of land," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of all she had learned. "She left me a language. Thank you for staying with us, for Cora's story. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest legacies are often found in the quiet wisdom the world has overlooked." If you were moved by her journey, please give this video a like and subscribe for more tales of hidden strength and unexpected discovery. We'll see you next time.